Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for tonight's discussion of The Elephant Man from 1980. I was surprised by this movie, knowing by whom it was directed. And one of the things I'm curious about is to know whether any of you were as well. I know someone who's not surprised, and that is the person who suggested the film and who appreciates just about everything made by David Lynch, my colleague, Jacob Mazer. Jacob, how are you tonight?
I'm well, thanks, Andrew. Hope all of you are well out there, and I'm looking forward to talking about The Elephant Man with you.
And I always appreciate my co-moderators' introductions, but I thought yours for this was especially helpful in situating the film in a bunch of different streams of sort of cinematic approach or thought. So that was great. But I'm not going to talk all night. You all get to talk. And the way to do that is right up on your screen. Please keep your audio on mute until I call on you to ask your question or make your comment. I will know to do that because you will please raise your hand using the raise hand function within Zoom, at which point I will call on you and ask you to ask your question or make your comment. And then Jacob and or I will respond and we'll proceed that way. Please do raise your hand and speak up. We would love to hear from you and have a real conversation about the film. But if you are shy or you sort of have something that you want to share with the group, you can definitely use the chat function within Zoom as well. Our colleague Jill will be on there, and if anything sort of bubbles up for us to address, she'll let us know. And that's also a great way to introduce yourself to the group and to let BMFI know, if you're joining us from outside the greater Philadelphia area, how you found us and how you think we're doing. So with that, I think we are ready to start. Let's see, who do we have tonight? Back in form, the Glussmans, quick on the draw. Glussmans, go ahead.
First, we have to stop laughing. Good evening to both of you. It's I'd like to say see you again, because we would love to see you more, but good to be seen. So a couple of comments about the film, and then I'm going to make a side comment. I thought that while David Lynch's reputation is amazing, I thought that this film was ever so slightly inconsistent from his perspective. I thought that, I'm going to make up a number, 2/3 of the film was really, really well directed. And I thought that there were other pieces, at least from this viewer, where I thought that it was less clear and a little choppy. And choppy can also, of course, be the editing. But I think for better and worse, Director Lynch gets either the credit or the blame at the top of the billing. I also thought that Anthony Hopkins' portrayal was interesting. I thought it was probably an 8 out of 10 for him. I thought he did a really good job of showing the sort of scientific interest, along with being a little bit too much of the showman, which of course was intentional. I think Lynch did a good job of portraying that. I had a slightly unusual background in the film, in that shortly after the film came out, several of my clients and friends were involved in what is known as the Lisa H patient, who was a neurofibromatosis patient who was operated on at Children's Hospital in December of '81. So I view this film from the point of view of a layman who understood an awful lot of what went in medically many, many years later, and how different Lisa H's experience was, not from originally with her disfiguration, but rather with the way she was treated in the medical community, and the research that went into understanding the disease process and making significant improvement. Although she never had normal outcome, but it was way, way, way different. So with that background and my little comment, maybe the two of you can talk about the my director and actor notes.
Sure. Thank you as always for your thoughtful observations. Jacob, where would you like to start with the direction and the pacing that David found to be at least partially choppy, or with Hopkins' performance?
Well, let's start with Anthony Hopkins. Actually, sometimes it's good to begin with the narrative elements before we talk about the sort of formal elements. I think Hopkins gives a very powerful performance, and part of that for me is because it's rather restrained. You know, we know that Anthony Hopkins is somebody who can muster incredible power. And he can choose scenery if he wants to. He doesn't always. Here, he's rather restrained, and I think it's a valuable performance because I think the character of Treves is one who goes on an important sort of moral journey, or perhaps that's overstating it, but a sort of journey of self-discovery through the film. You know, that's one of the axes that the narrative of the film follows, as Treves sort of works to distinguish himself from this counterpart, Bikes, where Treves is measuring the appeal of the prestige, is at certain points indulging the scientific community's, I guess, more objectifying, sort of leering tendencies during that period to exhibit oddities as if they were specimens, as well as to take advantage of the social cachet and the prestige of being the caretaker of this unusual human. And this sort of is weighed against this sort of humanistic journey that he goes along. You know, Treves takes a longer time, I think, to really be moved and empathetic and connect with John as, you know, a full human than do some of his colleagues. I'm thinking of his supervisor, John Gielgud, Dr. Cargam, as well as his wife, both of whom are immediately, it seems like, struck in a deeper way by John's plight than Treves is. And it takes Treves, you know, a while to sort it out. He asks at one point, am I a good man or am I a bad man? And I think this is, you know, we often focus on John Merrick's journey through this film, and rightly so. It's an interesting one, and it's a moving one, in my opinion. But Treves goes on a journey himself. That's one of the paths that we follow through the film. So to me, Hopkins's performance, you know, makes that feel very tangible and very convincing. What do you think, Andrew?
I think that I really appreciated, I guess I would say I'm in your camp. I really appreciated Hopkins' performance. I think for all the reasons you said, I think that he is someone who, in part because of the character he received the most acclaim for playing and made the most money playing and has spent the most time playing, namely Hannibal Lecter, he has tended in recent years to have big performances. I also think sometimes as actors age, and I don't think of this really primarily as a function of their chronological age, as much as I think of it as a function of their time acting and their career as movie stars becoming longer than their time working their way up as an actor. I feel like you see it with Al Pacino. I feel like you see it with Robert De Niro. Performances get bigger and bigger and bigger. So seeing this relatively early in his career, I think, you know, he's doing a more restrained, more thoughtful, perhaps take on this. That I think his performance is one of the ways this film is trying to give us a sense of and consistently remind us of the era. this is a movie that is very, I think, never wants us to forget when it is set. It's a Victorian period piece, and it wants to have us think about everything that means, right? There's that part in the beginning when we first meet Hopkins, when he's performing that surgery on that worker who was, I think, who was severely injured in an industrial accident. And there's that talk about machines, and we're going to see more of these, and you can't reason with a machine, and all these sorts of things. And there are different periods and interludes. And I think this might be sort of an element related to the choppiness David mentioned, to remind us of the period. And I think that there are certain expectations of dispassion from a man of that period, a professional of that period, a doctor of that period, and a doctor of some stature, which he seemed to me to be, or on his way to being. So I think there's a dispassion that is part of the character that could possibly be interpreted, or mistaken for something of a weaker performance. But I appreciate his performance a great deal.
I don't want you to think my 8 out of 10 thought it was a bad performance. I was saying 8 out of 10 for Hopkins. If I took his career, I would put this at the 80th percent.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. I thought you were sort of giving him a low B. And
my apologies to Hopkins, to Sir Anthony.
I understand. And when you think of it that way, over 50 years of making movies or whatever it is, then I guess an 8 out of 10 is pretty good. But whether you meant this or not, David, I could certainly imagine people who have known Anthony Hopkins primarily for his work in the last 30 years might have thought some of those things, or else I was just, sharing my thoughts and wasting everyone's time regarding the abrupt nature of some aspects of the film, and some of that sort of choppiness at the end. I can see that. I think that there are, I can see how one would come away with that impression, particularly because it's a movie that takes its time with certain moments and certain elements, or sort of important points in the Merrick story. And then there are other times when it sort of seems to, move rather quickly through things. And, I took, and most of the moving quickly to me happens toward the end, after he's been taken from the hospital. And I personally was glad that segment of the film was choppy and abrupt, because I found it to be so sort of horribly sad. And frankly, I feel like, sort of like a horror movie, the way a horror movie can function is it didn't have to show me anything. It set up a premise that I knew how sad it was going to be, regardless of what I saw. So I didn't miss the choppiness of that as much. I also think that, you could think, on the other hand, if the movie spent as much time as it might have with his horrible experience after he's taken, that really is a lot of torture for the character, a lot of torture for the audience. And I don't think that is what this movie was going for. But I see what you're saying. And I do think it is probably a function of partially the screenplay, partially perhaps Lynch's relative inexperience with feature narrative filmmaking, particularly in what is much more of the Hollywood mode than what he had done before, and much more so than much of what he would do down the line. And I also think it's possible that it is a function of the very small budget, or the challenging nature of the production, though none of that is an excuse. What I will not chalk it up to is the editing, because it is edited by Anne Coates, who is one of the greatest editors of all time and edited Lawrence of Arabia and many, many other wonderful classic movies. She has edited some stinkers, as anyone who has a 60-year career editing mainstream movies will do, but I'm not going to fault her for any of the stinkers. I'm not saying this is a stinker, but I think she does the best with what she's given. At least that's been the the dominant element of her career. So I think that's probably true here. Jacob, did you have anything to add about the structure or the pacing?
Well, one of the things that I think is perhaps could be taken as, choppiness, or, as one of the interesting dimensions of the film is the ways that it switches registers. We have, I think, an expectation of a lot of period films that they'll be sort of stately. And The Elephant Man is at times, but it also sort of touches in this familiar to David Lynch fans, this sort of visceral but also surrealistic, register. We certainly have interjections of this kind of dreamlike visual language, this dreamlike cinematic language. We have shifts in tone where, I think the first 10 minutes or so of the film feels sort of like a horror movie. And then, you get further in and it feels like a tearjerker melodrama. And then there's also just the sort of experience and kind of tone of the film. I mentioned the sort of stateliness of, of the period drama as it's often rendered. But Lynch is somebody who loves to emphasize the sort of tangible, powerful, experiential details of the world. So when somebody lights a match in a David Lynch movie, it goes, and when somebody walks down a hallway, in a David Lynch movie, you hear their heels go boom, 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 boom. And so it's full of this, sense where the world feels very sharp and loud and acute. And then we also have this undertone throughout much of the film of this sort of industrial moan. So I think it sort of fits into the themes of the film and the ways that it kind of shifts between, perhaps this portrayal of a society of finery and opulence, and its sort of industrial underbelly, and its as well as representing both the positives and negatives of the of the human character as we see it in the film. But I certainly could understand how a viewer might be sort of put off or jarred around by that a bit.
Jacob, you made two wonderful points there that I just have to comment on before we get to our next comments, which the first is that a lot of our perceptions and expectations comes from what genre a movie is. And in the case of a movie that has multiple genres or no genre or veers, the genre we decide it is. And what you said about a period piece, if we think of this, and the movie asks us to a large degree to think of this as a period piece, then we have one set of expectations for how it's going to tell its story, how much information it's going to give us, and how easy it's going to make it for us to follow, or how hard it is. If we think of this as a social problem film, we have a set of expectations. We think of it as a melodrama. If we think of it as, a sort of horror isn't right, but, something with those sort of elements of fear, or if we think of it as avant-garde, all of which at different points the movie can sort of lay claim to, then our expectations would change. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And that was a great point. The other thing is that you brought up the sound, which I thought was exceptional. I mean, I don't often watch a film, and especially one that isn't, science fiction or action or a superhero movie or something like that and say to myself, boy, this sound, there's so much of it, but it all makes so much sense and it is adding so much to the sense of place and time. And this movie did that so well. I completely agree. Let's see. Gene, you're up.
Silver medal this time. Woohoo! I'll get that gold medal back in my hands. You wait, Glessmans.
Well, I don't know about
that. Just to touch on a point you made about the sound, all these amplified details in the sound that are of common things like the matches and the footsteps and things. I'm sure that must have a relationship to Lynch's passion for mindfulness and meditation and how he perceives the world. But I also wanted to mention, as you notice, I keep putting up these Zoom images that are themed on the films we watch. And before I rewatched this, which I haven't seen in maybe 20 years, I was thinking, okay, something tongue-in-cheek with an elephant, da-da-da-da. But after watching it, it was so moving and so heartbreaking that I wasn't even going to go near something that would challenge his legacy or his dignity. It just touched me that much. So I just decided, here he is, probably, looking his finest. But it moved me enough to just make a decision like that. But anyway, I had two quick questions. Do you know anything about why Mel Brooks decided to produce something like this, which is so different from everything we know of his work? And two, what do you make of those quote unquote, I guess, dream sequences? Do you think they're meant to be John's dreams or delusions about maybe his own origins, or is it more to be treated as an abstract ingredient to set the tone for the film?
Those are two really interesting questions. Jacob, did you have in getting ready? I know you mentioned Mel Brooks a good bit in your introduction. I'm wondering if you could either sort of pick up on that note of how he got involved with the movie.
Sure. So I when you research the film, you will find that the records state that Mel Brooks was originally given the script by his babysitter. Details further than that, hard to parse. But suffice to say, the script came to Mel Brooks. He was starting a new production company, and this was among the first, if not the first project he took on. Now, Mel Brooks, I think, was specifically interested in doing something as a producer that was different than the kinds of films that we know Mel Brooks by, like Blazing Saddles or, Young Frankenstein or what have you. Brooks, though obviously a crack comedian, was also sort of an intellectual and sort of an artistic sophisticate. And he felt like that side of him, I understand, was kind of underutilized. So he was looking to produce a project that sort of spoke to that part of his interest and his personality. Now, one thing that you'll notice if you look at the credits of the film and the poster art and so forth is, although the film is credited to Brooks Films, which is Mel Brooks's production company, you don't see Mel Brooks's name on it. And that decision was made specifically, it doesn't say produced by Mel Brooks or anything. And the decision was made specifically because they didn't want people to enter the film expecting it to be, a romp or something like that. I have some thoughts about the second part of your question, Gene, but let me kick it to Andrew for a second. I'm interested to hear your take.
The only thing I'll say about Mel Brooks is that, we think of him for, certainly if you think about that point in his career, right, the very end of the 1970s, right, it is Blazing Saddles, it is Young Frankenstein, it is the producers, and not even the sort of the Broadway version of Producers, which is a little classier because it's on Broadway, but the original movie. And so, he, like a lot of a lot of filmmakers, a lot of artists. I think Jerry Lewis is a great example with some points of comparison. Want to do other things and have other ideas and have other interests and want to apply the skills they've learned making films in a very sort of narrow frame to other experiences or other opportunities. And I'll tell you that the first Mel Brooks movie I ever saw was not one of those more famous ones, but the one that came out 3 years after The Elephant Man, called To Be or Not to Be, which is a remake of an Ernst Lubitsch movie. And if you can find two filmmakers who worked in Hollywood in what is technically the same genre, who are more different than Ernst Lubitsch and the pre-1980 Mel Brooks, you know, you get a cigar, because they are so different. So he was clearly at that point in his career interested in, you know, flexing different muscles or you know, making different types of movies. And I would even go so far as to say that when he later on returned to the sorts of, you know, farcical things that he became best known for, his heart wasn't in it, because they weren't nearly as good as the ones from earlier in his period and in his career. Now, I think that part of that has to do with the changing world, and part of that has to do with people's changing ideas of what's funny. And, you know, he's probably putting jokes in his movies with one hand tied behind his back, because there's certain jokes that fall out of favor and things like that. But regardless, he clearly had other things he was interested in. And so I think this sort of, in that larger context, makes a bit more sense. And the fact that he didn't put his name on it, and that he was less prominent about, you know, his association with it, suggests that he really was interested in trying to see if he could help make different types of movies. Do you remember Gene's other point? Because I've already forgotten it.
Yeah, so we were, Gene raised the question of the film's more abstract moments.
Yes.
And I think this is a great question, and something that's important to sort of grapple with as we talk about this film. So, you know, in my, well, I'll start by saying, as with, in my opinion, most sort of abstract media, part of the pleasures of it is that it's open-ended, and each viewer can bring, or each observer can bring their own perspective and their own interpretation, their own sort of interpretive toolkit to it. In my introduction, I likened David Lynch to sort of an expressionist, somebody who's looking for ways to render in the screen, you know, and in the universe of the film, elements of the story or the scenario that aren't purely tangible, that aren't purely visible, but that are there nonetheless. And so there are various ways that Lynch does this through the film. There are some moments where it seems like there's one sequence in particular where it's framed sort of like a dream, but there's various other moments too where sort of apropos of nothing, at least nothing direct in the, you know, in the most basic narrative, you know, we get these images that sort of come out of space. Two of the images that we see most often that sort of haunt the film and haunt John are these, are different images of his mother. One of this photograph of his mother, which sort of comes to life in various ways, that we zoom in on or zoom out of in various ways. The other is this instance of his mother in some kind of violent encounter with an elephant. And these speak to sort of two different narratives about, to my mind, speak to these sort of two different narratives about John and how he sees himself and how others see him. The myth of John, the idea of John, that haunt him through the film. You know, one in which he is the product of some kind of strange interspecies violent encounter, as the his quote unquote proprietor, Mr. Bites, says in his, freak show introduction. The other is this, this idea of Jean as, a devoted son and as a human being, as the son of a mother. Various characters, including John himself, sort of go back and forth between sort of which version is shining and which version is in eclipse. And so, I mean, for me and for this viewer, I appreciate the way that Lynch is able to sort of weave these ideas and these images, through the film in ways that are visually exciting and interesting and engaging and moving and powerful, but that would be hard to render in a more realist mode. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
I mean, I don't know. I didn't know much about the actual Merrick, but something about the way the movie starts suggested to me that this is a story that his origin is a story, is a fabrication, perhaps one that we don't know the source of it. Maybe Bites came up with it, maybe Merrick believed it. I don't really know that, but I think that part of the point of having a moment like that and the moment at the end and the few that are sprinkled throughout is to in a way open things up for us to to cue us or remind us to not be tied. This isn't about facts. It's about a doctor and his patient, one of the most famous doctor or patient pairs in sort of popular culture, but this isn't about science, and this movie isn't about science, and it's not about fact and all that. It's about more personal, subjective things. And I think having those moments really helps to remind us of that. And that's one of the reasons why I forgive the movie, the choppiness. The movie's trying to do a lot, and it's trying to suggest a lot to us, and it has a lot of balls in the air, and I think it does. I really think it doesn't really drop any of them. I think it might come close. There's a few close calls, but I think the movie's got a lot on its plate, and I think it does a good job with it. And I think that's one of the things. I also think, and as many of you have heard me say many times before, it is so difficult in a movie, particularly one that has so much on its plate like this one does, to give us a sense of what characters are thinking and feeling inside. Mm-hmm. And this is another way to do that. And I think it's an effective way. And I think it's interesting that his vision of his mother at the end is so different from the one at the beginning. The conclusion I drew from that is that he is a different man. He has had different experiences, and he is in a much, I would say, better, but at least different place than he was. So the things either the way he remembers his mother or the things he chooses to remember about her have changed, quite understandably. Let's see. Dana, you had a question or comment.
Good. Hi, guys. Well, so you'll forgive me, but I want to just come back to Anthony Hopkins for a minute.
Sure.
But of course I do. You would expect. I saw something else too about it that I thought was so brilliantly nuanced. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but I really think this was a particularly fantastic performance. And here's why. First of all, I thought that his lack of emotion, well, there was emotion twice. The first time we saw emotion was clearly when he sort of started to cry, but never really cried when he first went backstage, back to and saw Merrick. We saw his eyes fill up, and that was it. And the other time we saw emotion was when Wendy Hiller sort of accused him of being more of a, of exploiting Merrick just as he had been before. And he didn't blow up at that moment, but later on was when he did. Other than that, we don't see Anthony Hopkins do anything emotionally at all. And I think that what happened to me as I was watching it, I was thinking he was taking the place of me. I was sort of in suspense for when he was going to boil over, and he never did. So I did as a result. And interestingly, he never did. And yet, and Andrew, this reminds me of something that you say all the time, that movies sort of give us the pieces, but we have to fill in between things. What happened to me at the end of this film, when I'm surprised somebody hasn't brought up the Barber music, that the adagio of strings, that absolutely painful piece of music that we've heard in other films like Platoon and so forth, which is so emotional and sad. And I thought to myself, at the end, tomorrow morning, Treves is going to walk into this room and he's going to see that Merrick has done what he's always dreamed of doing, which is lie on that bed with his head he took off the pillow so he could lie on his bed and die like a real person. And Treves is going to cry, because that's what I put together. That's what I was able to do with the emotion. And I thought the reserve in Anthony Hopkins's performance was so meaningful to me for that reason. The lack of his emotion let me have more of it. And it gave me that end moment where I could picture that magnificent burst of emotion, which might not happen, but I wanted it to make the movie really work. So I thought that emotional ending and his reserve together made for something really, really special in this movie.
Well, those are really, really great points, and not simply because you reference something that I say, but what I will add is, I think we're given clues that the Hopkins character knows that this was a watershed moment for Merrick. The way he says so many times, I'm pleased that, you found it so enjoyable, or whatever the words are. And the way he repeats himself, and the way he says, this isn't someone who has trouble speaking. This is someone who has trouble speaking when he's trying to show a level of care and emotion that he is not culturally or professionally equipped to show. And, it really reminded me of that moment in Rain Man, where Tom Cruise realizes he has a connection, and he very, 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 very hesitantly goes to hug his brother because he thinks they've crossed that threshold where he can handle physical contact. And he goes to do it, and Dustin Hoffman, sort of pushes him away, which, that's fine. But it was a character who was feeling emotion. I don't mean Dustin Hoffman, I mean Tom Cruise was feeling emotion he didn't know how to handle. And he was supposed to be the character of the duo that is in charge, but he didn't know what to do in that moment. And I think that's what's going on with the Hopkins character at that scene at the end. And so I agree with you. He will be in that room by himself when he finds Merrick, and he will have no one to protect his reputation from except himself, and he will probably break down. But he wanted to the night before, and that was how we know, I think.
This is well, yeah. This is. I think it's well observed. Yeah, we must remember this is the famously non-emotive Victorian masculinity that we're dealing with here. But yeah, I think the restraint of it and the sort of awkwardness of Treves trying to handle these heavy emotional situations is so well chosen. I'm thinking again of that scene at the end where John says this. It's one of the last things John says to him. It's a very profound thing. She says, "I'm happy every moment because I know that I'm loved." That's like a very pure thing to say from the heart. And Treves says something like, I've benefited a lot from our relationship too. Like he doesn't equal it, you know. In that character,
Right.
yeah, right. And that character can't. I mean, it tells us something about John too, because John is emotionally intelligent enough to recognize the feeling, you know, and the bond and the friendship from Treves, although Treves is not able to articulate it, you know. In a way, it's John sort of recognizing Treves's disability. I was struck in my most recent watch of the film by, I think, a very subtle but very well placed moment that Treves has towards the end. It's when they're in the box at the theater, and we see John mesmerized by the show, and then we cut to Treves, and he's not watching the show; he's watching John. You know, and it's such a difference in the character from the beginning. You know, when he refers to John as that. You know, what's that thing that you have in your office? You know, you know, not so crudely as bikes, but not in a sort of warm, empathetic, you know, compassionate way. And we understand, you know, just by seeing the care and the attention that Treves is giving to John, by the concern that he's showing and the interest in John's experience, that this is a man who's changed, even though he's not the kind of character who can speak as openly and directly as it turns out Merrick is able to do.
Robert, you had a question or comment?
Oh, yes. I saw this. I know, Andrew, you said that this is a Victorian period drama. So
well, that's one of the things it is. I don't think that's the only thing.
Well, what struck me was the class antagonism in this movie. I mean, I just saw this as a kind of uppity, you know, British upper class people looking down on the workers. And I've never seen a movie which is so bifurcated between the people living in this sort of underworld, you know, and these workers underground in the dark, and they're working their behinds off on these machines. They're getting killed and maimed by the machines. And they're in a, you know, whenever you saw Mr. Bites, he was living in this little cave that almost looked like it was under the ground. And then we have on sort of above the ground, we have these kind of self-important aristocrats running around with their tuxedos and their canes and their 4 o'clock teas, and they love Shakespeare and they can quote the Bible. And it's like this guy, Merrick, was sort of like an alien that came from another planet, you know, and so what do? You know, these people try to, you know, inculcate him with their values and you know, the fact that their hearts went out to him. Why? Because he could remember some psalm in the Bible, you know, and he could appreciate Shakespeare. It's all the things that they love, you know. But when you look at the underclass, the so-called working people who were struggling to keep doing all the work in the society, you know, they treated him like crap. You know, they had no morals. They just looked at him as an object. And except the only working class people who treated him humanely were fellow freaks. When he was in that circus and Bites would put him in a cage, the people who they were working class poor people, they came out and saved him, but they were freaks. Okay, so so whenever he was with the so-called working class, he was treated terribly inhumanely, whereas these genteel, you know, educated people, you know, they knew the right thing to do, and they're the moral people in the world, and you know, and and at the end, it seems like, that's what we're supposed to go away with. Like, this guy Merrick, he internalized all this upper class stuff, and then he can die peacefully and go to heaven and the stars and everything. And it just seemed like a real attack on the working classes. That's all.
I really disagree with that reading of it. I think this movie has, upper class people who are good, upper class people who behave terribly, working class people who treat people well, and working class people who treat people terribly. The terrible picture of the working class includes certainly Bites, as well as the night watchman who is selling access to Merrick and completely just having no respect for him as a person. But on the other side of the coin, there is the other night watchman who turns him in, and also the head nurse, if that's what her role is, who's clearly a working class person as well, who risks her job, and whatever other sort of social stigma might have been, attached to her for really for yelling at, right, for calling out her boss or her superior or her better at this institution. A man, a doctor, and someone from a different class at the place she works. She really put herself out there to do that. And I think that there are good upper class people as well. I think the actress played by Anne Bancroft has a genuine interest in and affection for Merrick. I think then on the other hand, I think what the head nurse yells at Treves about is those people he's letting in, those well-to-do people who, view meeting with Merrick as a sign of social status, who don't, as she says, don't even try to hide their shock at his appearance. So I think what the movie's saying is that there are, there's a range of humanity, there's a range of compassion, there's a range of human decency, among people who have a lot of financial resources and come from the right families, and among the people who don't have those things. The last thing I would say is, we assume that, I think there's an assumption made, and I don't think it's a fair one, that Merrick expresses interest in and participates in quote unquote high class, pastimes and such, because those things are foisted on him. I don't think that's the case, and that may be our own expectation of the film, but I don't think there's anything in the film that suggests that to us. First of all, I don't think having tea, my understanding is that having afternoon tea is something that runs the gamut of the class system in Britain, and similar countries. But the other thing too is that we learn early on in the film that Merrick can read. Merrick not only can read, he has a pretty good understanding of a lot of what he does read, and he seems to have some genuine familiarity with some aspects of literature or the theater when he talks to Mrs. Kendall. So, I think that I don't think he's set up as a caricature when he's wearing those clothes and he's engaging in those hobbies and talking with those people. So I don't think the film has a simple view of class.
But I think it's if he hadn't quoted the Bible, then that big doctor would not have come back and reconsidered whether to kick him out. But just because he quoted the Bible, in other words, he did things that pleased the upper class, and that's what accepted. But if he had rejected Shakespeare, if he rejected the Bible, and if he wasn't so articulate, then they would have just thrown him out.
I think the question, I don't think the throwing him out that John Gielgud would have done was a result of whether he was literate or not. I think it was a result of, he didn't appreciate that he had been coached for their meeting.
Uh-huh.
And he wanted to have a genuine interaction with him. And he had been denied that really by Anthony Hopkins. And so when Merrick goes beyond that, it is an indication that this is not so simple a case. And I think that the Gielgud character is someone who goes through a change, right? Just as the Hopkins character goes through a change. And I think that the fact that that characters of both classes can change, and we see them in the film, I don't think that it's a simple, wealthy bad, wealthy good, working class bad. I mean, in fact, I think that there's so many different views of that, so many different characters from these different walks of life that fall on either side of the ledger, that it can't be a simple formula. But Jacob, please, you've been wanting to say something.
Sure. Robert, thank you for your perspective. And I do think I have perhaps a different perspective, although I do think you are right to observe that the film does set up this sort of overworld, underworld structure. Now, again, I have maybe a different take on it than you do. And I guess as a sort of intro into my thinking about it, I want to reference an image from another David Lynch film. It's probably the most famous one from his, maybe in his whole filmography. It's from his film Blue Velvet. And in this scene, we begin with a vision of a sort of beautiful suburban lawn with white picket fences and bright red roses and a beautifully landscaped flower bed and all that. And then the camera pushes in closer and closer towards the plants and the flowers. And then the camera brings us down through the grass underneath, and beneath this idyllic suburban landscape, we see these insects rutting and scuttling in the dirt. And this is, one of the ideas that I think is really at the heart of a lot of Lynch's work, which is that these two worlds coexist with each other, and that both are part of the other. This is my interpretation. So how does this apply to the Elephant Man? We definitely do see this sort of opulent world where people behave in mannered ways and, have polite conversations in well-appointed drawing rooms and all this. And then we see this sort of grimy underworld, the world of the freak show and the carnival and the industrial labor and all this. But what strikes me about it is that I think Lynch does some work to mirror them and to parallel them. For example, there's a scene early on. It's in, I believe, the first private meeting between Treves and Bites, and Treves makes arrangements for John to come see him, basically to be exhibited as a anatomical oddity before the Doctors' Congress or whatever it is. And Bites says, "We've exchanged more than money," or something like that. He says, "You and I are the same." And indeed, when we see that sequence where Merrick is exhibited, and if you recall the way that it's filmed, it's almost like a Twisted Peep show or something like that, where we see his shadow through this curtain, and we see the crowd gawk at him. It's hard not to think of the freak show that we've just seen. This is a room full of prestigious Victorian professional gentlemen, but it's hard not to be reminded of the carnival that we've just seen. And as Andrew alluded to, we also have this instance. Even once Treves has started to treat John in a more humane and a more collegial way, there's a sense in which he's still this sort of object of spectacle. So, I guess what I'm inclined to think is that Lynch is sort of illustrating, the ways that these tendencies, both good and bad, I would say, both noble and corrupt or vicious, sort of come up in whatever room you're in, whether it's a dank, dark, oily cellar, or in a lavish living room with full of finery.
It's just fascinating that this poor man, who's sort of like an alien, he starts in the underworld and then he comes up to the upper world, but then he gets dragged back down into the underworld, and then he comes back up to the upper world, and then he dies peacefully. I just found that fascinating about going between the two worlds.
Right. John is a character who can move and does move in between both worlds. And, as I mentioned, this is a theme that we see a lot throughout Lynch's oeuvre, where, we have this sort of overworld and this underworld, and the journey that we take through them is, with characters who can cross that border, who can cross back and forth.
Right.
And I think part of the point of the movie is that you don't have to be an unusual individual like Merrick to experience some of the harsh treatment that he experiences. I think that's why the movie starts the way it starts. I think it starts that way for other reasons too. The general setting of the era. Two, to show us that that Treves is a doctor who's a bit different than other doctors, and things like that. But I also think the point that you, Robert, and others have been making about the harsh depiction and treatment of a lot of working class people in this movie, I think part of the larger point is that, the case of Merrick is a crystallizing example, but the reality is that the world is filled with man's inhumanity to man. And to the point some people have made in the chat, certainly the early portions of the Industrial Revolution were basically, built on that, as were lots of other things in the history of humanity and civilization. So I think that's part of the point. And I think a lot of what you say is in line with what the film is trying to communicate. I just don't think it's as perhaps cut and dried as we're used to seeing. That's all.
I should say, may I just add that not only do we see this sort of dichotomy in the human details of the film, but we see it in the architectural world of the film too. We see Lynch is careful that we know. We see both the clock tower and we see the gears grinding inside. That we see the cathedral with its glorious spire, and we see the pipes, beneath the surface.
And we hear them. We hear the grinding of the clock gears. Yeah.
Right.
The clash of the machines.
Right.
Well, thanks very much, Robert. And it looks like we are out of comments and questions. Jacob, did you have any? Whoop, Dana's back. Dana, what do you got?
Bye. I just have a quick comment. I just find it really interesting that the timing of this movie, which of course has nothing to do, it doesn't know where it is, but very soon after this came, the AIDS epidemic and focusing on people who were gay. And 10 years later was the Disabilities Act. And this movie was sort of prescient because it was sort of a door opening on people being able, without realizing it, of course, people being able to look at people and saying, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't necessarily judge people by the way they look or act. Maybe they're more like I am than I realize. And I remember that being kind of a mind-blowing experience when I saw this movie in 1980. And soon after, there was really sort of a sea change in the thinking that we now sort of accept years later, but it was starting at this point where we began to look at people with disabilities as maybe not so different and not so other. And so I thought the timing of this movie was kind of interesting for that reason. That's all.
Well, thanks, Dana. I think that is an interesting sort of kind of positioning to think about, and I'll be honest, I hadn't thought about it. So thank you for mentioning that. Jacob, any final thoughts?
I guess I just wanted to ask you, Andrew, and anybody else out there, if there were any moments in the film that you found particularly moving, the part that always sort of cracks me when I watch it is when Merrick is talking to Treves' wife, who's much more emotionally intelligent than he is, and she's sort of overcome by she's just sort of overcome, as is he when he says, "I'm not used to being treated kindly by a beautiful woman," you know.
I think, and this is, I think, part, Robert just asked in the chat about the cinematography and how that sort of, facilitates the vision of what we take to be the filmmaker's vision of the story. My comment, my answer to your question is related to that, which is, over time, over the course of the movie, we learn that Merrick can talk, and he comes to talk quite well. But both early in the movie and at different points throughout the movie, we see Merrick seeing, right? We see at the end, we see him being drawn back to those drawings on the wall of the boy sleeping. We see him seeing when he's in the Treves parlor in their home. And I think this is a joint function of cinematography and editing that I found the suggestion that I am looking at what Merrick is looking at clear, but not heavy-handed. And I think that there's something about a seasoned, because it doesn't matter what the screenplay says. If the screenplay says, we see from Merrick's view the pictures on the Treves' fireplace or whatever, it doesn't matter if it says that or not. When we're watching the movie, what matters is, can the camera operator who, if he or she isn't the cinematographer, is working directly under the cinematographer's instruction, can he or she make the shot of those things suggest to us as viewers that that's a person looking, that's that character looking. And that's something I think the movie's very, very effective at, without doing, and then Coates gives us just enough shots of Merrick looking to remind us that's what's happening, without sort of constantly having to go back to with us seeing him look, as to let us know that we're seeing what he's seeing. And I think that there was a concern raised early on about choppiness. You talk about an opportunity for choppiness, and I think because of the seasoned hands doing the editing and cinematography, that's one of the things that works, so smoothly in this movie, and impacted me, because I don't think necessarily impacts most viewers, but obviously because of what we do, I pay attention to how movies are put together and how they're working on me as a viewer. And I had to really remind myself that it was working on me, when it would have been very easy to make it painfully obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that helps with identification with the character who's doing the looking, right? And that's what this movie is so, that's one of this movie's biggest charges, right? Which is making us identify with Merrick. And I think it does that visually very well. I see the Glussmans have their hands up. They're not content to be the first people. They also have to be the last. So that tells you something.
Well, I'm not sure if that tells you, but that's up to you. I was really thinking about your comment, because I really felt that Lynch intentionally did a lot of the viewing and some of those scenes that look a little surreal as a recognition of the impairment of vision that Merrick had. And at least when I was watching it, I was viewing it thinking that I was viewing specifically a filmmaker's view of this impaired vision. And I thought that in that respect, he did a very good, subtle job without adding any choppiness, without forcing us to understand that. And if you knew about the visual issues as they were occurring, you got it, and if you didn't, hopefully you saw it. So I sort of thought that that was part of the vision, whether it's cinematography or direction, they work together.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. I now you do. I remember you mentioned it in the chat early on, and I meant to bring it up because I think that I think you make a very good point, and we can take it for people who like yourself who have more familiarity with some of the physiological issues related possibly to Merrick's condition, and people who've had comparable conditions. I think that that's a very good way. That's a very good thought, that element of it is trying to be conveyed. But I think it also works in a bit more of an abstract or metaphorical way, which is that, Merrick has had a very, certainly, and I talked about this earlier about how his vision, the way he sees his mother, or what he sees of his mother, has changed. It is very tortured and pained in the beginning, because that is the life he has known most recently and most thoroughly. And at the end, it is more hopeful and beautiful and brighter, because that he himself says that is what he's experienced. So I think there's a lot of there's a long lineage in movies of characters having vision problems being represented in the film. Sometimes it's a literal vision problem, but sometimes it's a metaphorical one. And usually in movies, though, this is what's interesting. Usually in movies, it has to do with that something about the way that characters, emotions or psychology exist, that they can only see the world a certain way. In this case, I feel like it's because of the cage he's been kept in, literally and metaphorically. He's only seen part of the world. And then when he gets to see more of the world, he has a different vision. But I think it's a very important point.
Right. The screenplay and apparently Lynch's understanding was, near where the medical world was. I mean, the name is neurofibromatosis, and these are fibrous growths on nerves, and the eye nerve is one of those that tends to be early impacted. So I did read that Lynch did a little bit of medical research for some of the conditions before he filmed.
Jacob, we also had a question in the chat. You had mentioned doubles in your intro, and I think there's one that even I could pick up on, which is Bites and Treves.
Right.
And I'm sure that you had that in mind. And it was good to not spell it out for us beforehand. I'm wondering, were there others you had in mind as well?
Well, Bites and Treves, I think, is the big one. And it's funny, even sort of visually, they both, although you wouldn't mistake one for the other, they both sort of wear a top. When we meet them, they're dressed similarly. They're wearing the same basic items of clothing, although one is, of course,
in different condition.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but right. So I do think there's this sort of doubling, that happens between these two characters. I also mentioned, I referred to this in the introduction, but there are characters who are not doubled sort of externally, like Treves and this other character Bites, but who are sort of doubled internally. And there I'm really thinking of John, and perhaps as a sort of attendant, element within John's mind, or thoughts, these two different visions of his mother too. But John, the question that John seems occupied with and tortured by through a lot of the film is, am I an animal or am I a man? Am I an abomination, who deserves scorn, or am I a human who deserves care and dignity? And we see, we see the way that he sort of goes in between both, I think. I mean, we see the way that ideas about both were sort of these sort of different origin stories for himself, you know, and I'm referring to the different visions of the mother that we see. We see how these sort of both sort of flow to the top of, perhaps they flow to the top of his mind, or they both sort of recur throughout the film. You know, and he seems to sort of oscillate back and forth between them, between moments of sort of self-confidence and moments of, you know, sort of self-disgust. You know, one of the most painful moments for John is when a mirror is forced on him. You know, when he's sort of forced to regard himself, or he's forced to double himself, is to look at this sort of other version of himself that's presented as, you know, the epitome of the grotesque, the epitome of the you know, undeserving of love. And you know, I think it's safe to say that to some degree, John resolves that at the end. I mean, he says one of the big expressive moments of the film is when he says, "I'm not an animal. I'm a man. I'm a human being." But I think these sort of two conceptions of himself coexist in him through much of the movie. And they're projected on him by different people in different times and in different ways too. So that was another element I was thinking of. Now, if you know the work of David Lynch, and especially as he continues in his career, you see this theme, you know, the doubling is sort of the kind of thematic, you know, context here. But this comes to play an increasingly important part, you know, in his oeuvre. And in later films, we see a lot of characters who are literal doppelgangers, who are like parallel with each other and sort of and blurred together in sort of much more intense and much more striking ways.
Well, thank you for that further explanation, Jacob, and thank you for suggesting a movie that I think has led to a very interesting discussion, and one that you know, I'll say for myself, I was very reluctant to see until it was suggested by you, and I'm glad that I accepted the challenge, if that's what I can call it. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us as well, for doing your part, as you always do, to make this such an interesting discussion. We have a few announcements. Our remote classroom is still in full effect. Tomorrow night, Paul Wright will be talking about Martin Scorsese. You can read a full description of how he plans to approach that great filmmaker's work and some of the movies he plans to talk about. Jacob will be discussing in a few weeks a very, very influential and very interesting science fiction film. It's so much more than that, but it is that, at least. A short film, one of the most influential short films in certainly modern cinema, La Jetée. And then we have another instance of our short attention span cinema, this time focusing on Latin American film, coming up toward the end of June. And after that, we will be turning our attention toward on-site education, which you'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks. Speaking of the coming weeks, we are going to be changing these discussions, as I'm sure many of you became aware from our Thursday email. This will be our last weekly discussion. We would have taken next week off anyway because of Memorial Day, but we will next be coming together for one of our free film studies online discussions on June 14th. The film will be revealed and an introduction will be provided for you in our Thursday email. And that's how we'll be doing things moving forward. We'll have one discussion a month on the second Monday of the month. And the film name and the introduction will be made available 3 weeks before. And so you'll have more time to watch the introduction, more time to see the film, and we will still have our discussions, but you know, folks are doing more things, and that's wonderful. And I have to say that I'm so happy with the way these discussions have gone for the last 15 months or so. And Jacob and I and our other colleagues have been some small part of that, but so much of how these have gone and so much of the experiences, the rewarding experiences we've all had over these many, many weeks have to do with you all, who don't just watch the movies and show up every week, but show up with interesting questions and great insights and new perspectives. And thankfully, something we could all use, great senses of humor when appropriate. We've just had some really wonderful conversations about some very interesting movies, and it you know, I could have shown up every week, but we couldn't have, you know, lively, enlightening discussions without you all. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you all in our new monthly on our new monthly schedule. And also hope to see some of you at some of the programs, education programs we'll be offering at the theater starting in July. We still have new movies available through Theater 5 that you can just get through streaming opportunities through theaters like ours. But there's a lot going on at Bryn Mawr Film Institute on site. We're showing movies. We have a lot of new movies out there. Movies are back. Online tickets, wonderful opportunity to reserve your seat in advance. There's a lot going on. Check it out at brynmarfilm.org. We also have a whole bunch of online opportunities as well, including our full film studies online library, community curated lists, all sorts of original puzzles related to the great films that we've been seeing and discussing. There's a lot happening at brynmarfilm.org. Then there's a lot happening at Bryn Mawr Film Institute right there on Lancaster Avenue. I hope to see you all there soon. And certainly at the very least, hope to see you for our discussion next month.
And
Thanks so much, everybody.
From this end, Andrew, before you sign off, we owe you and Bryn Mawr Film Institute so much for the many of us out here. Thank you.
I echo that. Thanks for making this past year so much more manageable.
Bearable.
To it. Bearable, yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Absolutely, absolutely. Guys are great.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
And for those of us that appreciated it, Andrew accepts checks on behalf of Bryn Mawr Film Institute, I promise.
He does.
Andrew.
Thanks all. And right there's a great short bit.ly link if you want to send us a gesture of your support that comes with a check or credit card element to it. We'll take any sort of support and appreciation you care to offer, but that kind is also greatly appreciated as well. Thank you all so much for joining us for all these many, many weeks, and for making this a really worthwhile and interesting and engaging endeavor. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Until
Farewell,
June
my
14th.
friends.
So we can shake hands in the theater.
That's right.